Hi, I'm Jim McCann, founder of 1-800-Flowers. I'm not satisfied when I learn something new unless I share it forward. And so we created this podcast to continue that, to share forward the wonderful people we get to meet and most importantly get to learn from and make our lives richer and better. Together we'll cover the human experience, and for me the human experience is foundational in the idea of relationships. The topics will be far-reaching, but the common element you'll see here is it's all about relationships. So I invite you to join us on this journey. Come experience it with us, share your thoughts and ideas, and become part of our community. We'd love to have you.
As members of the 1-800-Flowers Board of Directors, Adam, Hanft and Jim have a friendship stretching far back. Founder and CEO of Hanft Ideas, Adam is a globally known expert in strategy, marketing, branding, and messaging. He is co-author of Dictionary of the Future, a columnist for Huffington Post, Fast Company, and many more, and was a digital strategy consultant to President Obama's 2008 campaign. Called a marketing guru by USA Today, Adam had a successful career as an advertising agency founder, winning over 100 major awards, including an Effie for effectiveness, and created Your Bic, named one of the 50 greatest ad campaigns by Entertainment Weekly. Possessing an array of passions and area of expertise that complement Jim's, the two share ideas for a fascinating, open-ended conversation, covering everything from polarization and entitlement to comedy and climate. Let's learn how Adam Hanft shares it forward here on Celebrations Chatter.
There's so much I want to talk to you about, Adam. Back in late March, early April of 2000, so just weeks into the pandemic, you had some of the most amazing observations that ring in my head to this day, 2+ years later, about what kinds of things you thought would happen as a result of the pandemic. And off the top of my head, I remember you talked about suburban real estate getting a real jolt. And you used the example then of if people don't have to go into the office 5 days a week, and it's only 2 or 3 or 1, and they needed a place to work from home, they would move further out in the suburban ring. And you used, I think, the example of Dix Hills, Long Island. And you can get a good school system, and you can get more property and the extra bedroom and better taxes. And so that those houses became more attractive. But you said the near-in ring might not get the benefit because they're already too expensive and the taxes are too high, and you're paying for proximity that you might not need to be proximate to as much anymore, especially if live theater and live entertainment is retarded for some time. And all of that's proven to be exactly the case. And then you talked about workers who how they would choose employment based on the softer side of benefits in terms of working remotely. We talked about how you thought telemedicine would explode, and indeed it has. I mean, back then, NYU Langone in March of 2020, I think, was doing 300 telemedicine visits a week, and now it's stabilized at around 16,000. One thing you talked about back then, which I don't know if we know yet what the consequences are, but back then you spoke about if people were going to be reluctant to go to hospitals because of fear of contagion, what would happen to cancer diagnosis, treatment, and discovery? And I haven't heard any evidence of what the consequences of that diagnosis, starter treatment, interruptus as a consequence of COVID has yielded. I don't know. Maybe you do. But those predictions. Oh, and you said cities would come back. I think it's come back faster than certainly I would have thought. But you said they'd be younger, and that there'd be new creative uses for all the retail space, and all of those seem to be spot on. What do you see now, oh wise one?
Well, yes, I got some things right, but I do think back to just the diagnostic delay. What I've read is that there are a lot of cases of cancer or other chronic diseases that were not diagnosed early enough, and also people who were under treatment maybe didn't get timely chemotherapy, whatever oncology drugs they needed. So I think we're in an interesting moment now as we go towards endemicity, as it's called. I think more people. I read a statistic the other day that 40% of offices, this is nationally, not just New York. New York's probably lower, are filled, which is a reasonable number. I don't think we'll ever get back to 100. I think we'll get, although you see what JP Morgan is doing in New York, they just announced this gigantic Midtown investment on Madison. I think that young people will start to realize how much they miss the socialization of the office. I think we're human, we're social animals. We hang out. I think we need the buffer that the office represents. The Times had an interesting piece, the end of The Office Friend, and they were mourning the loss of the office friend. And I think it was a legitimate point of view. Office friends are not necessarily people that you work with every day, but as you wander around, you go to the coffee room, you go to the cafeteria, these are people that you have a relationship with, and you could kvetch, you could gripe, you could commiserate, and that's human nature. We need that, I think. And I think without that, business becomes more transactional.
And we work for a lot of reasons. We work obviously to sustain ourselves, but we work for social reasons too. We work for a reason to belong, to contribute. But social is a big part of work and where we choose to work when we have the option. And of course, we're always, we lose sight of the fact that lots of times we forget that 80% of the world doesn't have the options.
Right.
From a work point of view that some of us have in terms of working remotely. We talk about when will people go back to work, and 80% of the world is looking at like you have two heads, because
Right.
I drive a truck, I work a forklift, I work in a factory, I work in logistics, I work in assembly, I work in agriculture, I work in production. What are you talking about? When will I return to work? I never missed a day.
I never missed a day. And so two things. One is, do you think that when entitled people, essentially, who can work from home, say, I'm never going back, this is it, I'm adopting this new lifestyle, that there's a certain entitlement or arrogance to that, which is first world dismissiveness of the people who do the hard work that allows them to work at home?
Yep.
Do you remember a couple of years ago, I introduced you to Ronnie, who started Hi Bob, that HR startup?
Sure.
So they've done extremely well, by the way. They're one of the top 10 unicorns in Israel now.
Wow, that's terrific.
They have a 1.6 billion or some crazy valuation. But anyway, the reason I bring it up is one of the most fascinating things that I learned from his organizational mapping, which is not the traditional, if you remember, org chart. It really looks at connections between people, who brought who in, who's in the same running group as somebody else, the same book club as somebody else. And then they map the connections. They realize that there are people who were the glue of the organization, who may not be that high up in the organization, but they have these soft ties with so many people. And when those people leave, it destabilizes the organization. A lot of people leave with them.
How interesting.
They're nodes of connectivity. They're also culture carriers in a lot of ways. They may be people who've been there for a long time. Let's say there's an event in the office. Let's say, and I've seen this over the years, something happens. Somebody, the CEO leaves or somebody dies. It's interesting to watch whose office people collect in and gather.
Yes.
Right? It's not who you think. It's not the person who has the biggest signing authority. It's the person who has the EQ, who's built relationships, whose judgment you trust, and who's there to either commiserate or provide support. Those are the people that are the culture carriers of an organization. And they don't often get enough credit because they don't rank high necessarily. They may not be the biggest contributors in a traditional way, but they're culture contributors.
Can I extrapolate from that you would suggest that as employees, it's important for us to begin to think about those people, who they are, and how to embrace them and how to reward them for the things they do that we previously might not have measured?
100%. Dan Goleman, who wrote the book EQ, I think he says there's 7 different kinds of intelligence. We used to just measure one IQ. Yeah, Howard Gardner, yes. And Goleman, I think they're both working in the same area, but you're right, it was Howard Gardner. And it's the same idea, Jim, which is we need to widen the aperture of how we value people. And it's very much tied to your work with the differently abled community also.
He first talked about the Savant Syndrome.
Yes.
Meaning you might be disabled in one area or developmentally retarded in one area. It doesn't mean you can't be good in another area. And his hypothesis was because you only have this area that's a strength of yours, all of your energy is going into that area. I remember I met a young man, this is many years ago, who was developmentally disabled, institutionalized. And I had a conversation with him, and I was clued into it before time at a Sunday social event where we were gathering together as families. And his interest was airplane crashes. And he knew the date, he knew the pilots, their date of births, and the name of every passenger and where they lived on, it seemed to me, every US plane crash. And I tested him because there was one I was familiar with in the early 70s at Kennedy Airport. An Eastern Airlines plane from New Orleans went down, New Orleans. And I happened to be driving and got stuck in the traffic near behind when the accident occurred. So it was, the only one I had a real personal connection to, even though it wasn't that proximate. But I knew several people who died on a plane. There was a basketball player for the New York Nets. Wendell Labner was his name. And Wendell Labner, where he went to college, where he lived, it was just amazing. Here, in so many ways, he was developmentally disabled, but he had this fixation and this uncanny memory ability on such a obscure area of interest.
It's a lot of them are called mathematical savants, and I think we talked about this once. One of the areas of art we collect is outsider art, and a lot of the outsider artists, including one particular fellow named George Widener, who is a mathematical savant, and you say to him, "What day, did this date fall on in 1722?" He'll tell you immediately.
Yes.
And he's obsessed with the Titanic. He knows it's like the airplane, every single thing about the Titanic. And that's a big subject of his art. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And when Howard Gardner identified the different frames of intelligence, it was really before we understood technology. Now autistic people are debugging software.
There's a consulting firm in New York that I've met where they only hire people on the spectrum.
Yes.
And their particular skill is identifying what they'd be particularly good at, and then assigning them to projects that companies bring to them. Now, it'll go down to they're only good from 3 to 5 every day, and they work on spatial recognition. But it's not just what they're good at, but what time frames they work in and how best to give them assignments. It's remarkable what they're doing, and they're for profit and profitable.
But you can extrapolate from that too, Jim, and say on the corporate setting with people who are conventionally abled, if you will, all of the HR protocols, the Korn Ferries of the world, they look for people who are balanced, right? They promote people who are got some math skills, some science skills, and they look for sort of equalization and equal distribution of those skills, when in fact, that may not be what you need in a leader. I think McKinsey did some work actually to show that the best leaders that did not have skills equally distributed. They spiked in one area, and they really were not good in other areas. But they were so good at what they were good at that it more than made up for what they weren't good at. But the idea of well-rounded might be a bit of a misnomer when it comes to employees in general, I think, and extrapolating from the spectrum conversation.
Well, that goes to, I think, something we have spoken about. We've spoken about it at Flowers, and we've spoken about with Faith, our new head of HR there, which is the new role and the new importance of HR as challenged by the whole COVID pandemic experience in terms of what the labor shortage, the challenge of in the workplace, not very few companies, except for like the big consulting companies, can have essentially all of their workers be remote all the time. Other companies like Flowers, we have production people, we have delivery people, logistics. They don't have those options. So the role of an HR professional has changed and is challenged dramatically. And you put on that layer of it. That's why companies like iBob are so crucial now, because they bring a level of knowledge, a level of measurability
Yes.
In areas that heretofore were not deemed to be that important, and now are becoming much more critically important.
New tools, like, somebody could give somebody who did something good a shout out. You're not obligated to give somebody a shout out, but everybody gives a shout out, then is measured by the system. And it's another way to look at people through the lens of who is supportive and who isn't supportive. Let me ask you your view, without getting overly political, but we're in that world. I remember when there were stats that analyzed the Hillary Clinton versus Trump vote, and I don't remember the number, but I'll put it that basically she won 80% of the counties where people earned over $100,000 a year or so. It was like a very polarizing situation. So when I think about this going back to work issue and the sense of entitlement between the people who are what we used to call the knowledge economy, I don't know what we call knowledge workers, and the people who are the FedEx people, what that does to the American psyche, the American culture, the sense of we're not all in this together, we're two different classes in a way.
Well, I think it definitely contributes to it, and I'll take you down another path with that, because clearly you see it reflected in the political circumstance. I think what people in the physical worker economy, where they have to be there, I think what they resent most is when they hear people talking about when will people return to work, making the assumption that it's everybody.
Right.
While they're collecting the UPS, FedEx, and UPS, USPS parcels on their front steps. I think it's the arrogance. I think it's the attitude that really annoys people more than anything else.
A lot of that was reflected in the Great Resignation, as it's called, and a lot of that was happening in the restaurant and service industry, where people just basically said, I'm tired of being crapped on by entitled people, whether it's at the front desk of a hotel, or my drink didn't come fast enough, or the check didn't come fast enough, or you didn't tell me all the specials, or whatever micro complaint that people have. All that I think stacked up. And then when the opportunity came to say, I'm not coming back, they said, I'm not going to subject myself to that anymore. And if you read anecdotally, a lot of the coverage of the hospitality industry did point to the fact that people were abused.
And I think that internet anonymity may have contributed to that attitudinal divide, where anonymity allows people to not be themselves and to be more extreme in their political points of view, in their customer service attitude, the fact that they should be allowed to say anything, do anything, be as vulgar as they want, and you should have to take it because you're counting on my net promoter score.
Yes. Yes.
And
yes. We've institutionalized rudeness and a lack of civility.
I think you're right. Lack of civility for sure, and institutionalized rudeness. That's it. That's interesting. But let's take it down that political path a little bit more. And I've heard you opine on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear what your current thoughts are. And maybe it's my own naivete, but are we at a different era of the politicalization of brands?
Well, I would say yes. And the ironic thing, just quickly about Starbucks, is that Howard Schultz is fighting the union. And so he wants to have it both ways. He said that we would never, we don't need a union. We don't need somebody between us and our workers. And in fact, were Starbucks unionized, we would never have achieved the success we have. And this is somebody who is going to run in the Democratic primary, so which is who votes but people in the unions. Who do you need but people in the unions? But I think we're seeing a giant blur between what used to be the political sphere or used to be the commerce sphere, and it's complicated. I don't know if you read the article in the Journal about Disney and what Disney is going through, because they always studiously say we're this magical place, and you come here and there's no politics. Of course, implicitly there were, but we're not going to go down and debate these issues like other companies have chosen to target, and many of them. But now, because of Florida, they're stuck in this conundrum where they, in an effort to alienate nobody, they're alienating both sides. The progressive people, the progressive employees think they're not going far enough to fight the "Don't Say Gay," Ron DeSantis movement, And on the other side thinks they're going too far the other way. So they are really have this Hobson's choice moment. And they're not alone. I think every corporation is going to have to deal with having to piss off somebody, which is anathema to corporate communications. But
well,
I think
that's a question on all of our minds and has been for several years now. But it puts another layer of social and public responsibilities on business leaders, who, by the way, are quite trusted by the American public to do the right thing. I read just today that 68% of the public thinks that CEOs are well positioned to lead and to manage through thorny social issues.
and Edelman Trust Barometer shows that. It's tricky. For those people who care desperately about voting rights or whatever the social issue is, one way or the other, it could be guns, it doesn't matter. For those people, the moral imperative is raised so high, the ethical requirement to act is raised so high that the argument, which is I'm not an expert on it, is transcended by how important this moment in time is. It's like people say about the Ukraine, right? Like if we got genocide, when we have genocide or undisciplined and extensive bombing of civilians, does that mean that you need to take a stand? Has it risen to the level where you can no longer stand behind
exactly.
It's not my role anymore? And why do you think business is rated so high, 68%? Because business leaders have gingerly but realistically stepped into the political fray. And it's controversial for sure. I mean, look at Elon Musk, who's, completely undisciplined and has impulse control problems, clearly. But people love that. It's so interesting. It's like Trump. He is a billionaire, but he speaks outside the system at the same time. And people think he's not part of the system because he's so outspoken.
Well, it goes back to the two examples you had before, Starbucks and Disney, who I think if collectively you would have embraced those managements and had them in a quiet setting, they've been seen as such progressives in terms of how they approach their working populations and their points of view on the public, that they can't believe that they're having these issues because of look at what we've done. Look at our body of work.
Exactly.
But your point is that some issues are such hot issues, and the gun issue, the voting issue, that you really can't be correct as a business leader, because if you come out with a stance on something, even those who support you don't think you've gone far enough.
So yes, do you remember? Like, think back to the Vietnam War and the activist priests up and around Yale, around New Haven, and everywhere.
Yep.
I mean, they were a lot of conservative members of the church said we're not getting involved in politics, but the activist priests said the Vietnam War is such an existential moral crisis, we have to get involved. To me, it's a very, very similar argument.
I think that's an interesting parallel there.
Think back, since we're dating ourselves, to All in the Family and the debates that Rob Reiner had with Carol O'Connor.
Archie Bunker.
Yeah, Archie Bunker and Meathead. But they would fight and debate and argue, but they still sat at the same table. Now, what happened during COVID? People just refused to sit at the same table with each other.
Yes.
That to me is a very telling example of how we've devolved as a society. They disagreed, they yelled and screamed, but they sat down at the table together.
So what I would extrapolate from that is COVID has exaggerated the divide because of the lack of social contact, familiarity, and socialization.
Yes, and also the cultural wars have intensified. The wedge issues have become wedgier.
And now there's supportive media on each of those flanks.
That's right. That's correct.
Yeah.
We have the filter bubble, as it's called, the echo chambers. We didn't have that. We had Walter Cronkite, and we had Huntley Brinkley, and we had
columnists.
Right, and columnists. But we didn't have this incredible.
But it was news and there's opinion, and the lines are blurred now.
Completely. And we had Art Buchwald to make us laugh. We don't have, seriously, but where is the Art Buchwald of today?
Who makes you laugh today? Well, it's certainly not Chris Rock.
No.
The
So
slap heard round the world.
I know, but I do think that, you've heard the stories probably as I have about families that refuse to gather for Thanksgiving or Christmas
Absolutely.
because the political divides were so polarizing. You didn't have that despite the generation gap and all that, the March on Washington and all those massive protests. Somehow, when people came together as a family, they would disagree, but there was still civility, and we've lost that.
Tell me if you would, Adam, for someone who's plied their craft as a comedy writer, as you have for a number of years. What's happened to comedy now as a result of that? We kidded about the Chris Rock, Will Smith flap. What's happened to comedy? Is comedy divided? Are there conservative comics and liberal comics? Is humor in the same slippery slope?
Humor is struggling to be humorous because everybody is afraid of being canceled. So I do think that comedians will tell you that there is a risk of going too far. When humor is all about being transgressive, I'm not talking about bad behavior like Louis C.K. and I'm not talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about transgressive humor going back to Moms Mabley, Lenny Bruce. I mean, these were people who took on society and they said things that people thought, but maybe were not to be uttered in polite company. And humor was an insulating force. You were okay because you were a comic. You were up there on the stage and it was okay. I mean, I think it's phenomenally telling that now we have a comedian running the war in Ukraine. Everybody thought he was a joke, literally. But the thing about comedy is it's always been speaking truth to power.
Yes.
Its essence. And that's why there's more Jewish humor than WASP humor or Irish humor than WASP humor, because people in power don't need to be funny. They got the power. But
it is about speaking truth to power.
It is.
And this fellow Zelensky, just amazing to see what a person of history he has become in such a short time. And it's astonishing to see the role that media is playing in shaping our. It always has, and this man has become a man of history so quickly, and deservedly so.
I totally agree with you. And on paper, you would never hire him. And in fact, people thought, it was a joke. It was a protest movement, but it was a joke. And his approval ratings were low until what happened. So who could have predicted it? I don't know. But he clearly, as a personality, as a performer, understands how to use the media. But that is not enough. I mean, his ability to speak in front of every major governmental body in the West and get everybody to stand up and applaud. And
the UN, the American Congress, the British Parliament, it's amazing.
Yes. And he's very savvy. He's, everybody's wearing their suits and ties, and he's wearing his sort of camouflagey outfit.
Yeah.
He's a combat president.
But I mean, all of that symbolism really does matter, and it seems like it might be deliberate and deliberately smart.
I think it's well said. I think it's both. Unlike, Karzai, not Karzai, whoever was, the chicken shit guy who left Afghanistan, he refused to leave. He refused to leave his country. And the U.S., our intelligence estimates were way off, as were the Russians, for that matter.
Yep.
It's the ultimate underdog story, and he's the most important leader of the last, 50 years, because he also exhibited personal courage, and it's rare in today's cosseted, protected world for any leader of a state to exhibit physical courage.
Yes, I can't think of another recent example at all. Can you imagine that we're having a conversation here in 2022 about the war in Europe? I mean, it was unimaginable a few months ago. What happens? Is it the genie's not going back in a bottle? Do you have any sense of how this might end?
Putin has put himself in a corner. He's really not left himself a way out. I think the likelihood is that at a certain point, assuming sort of the standoff that we have now continues, that he will be replaced. I can't see it ending any other way. They tried to kill Hitler twice and they failed. I just think there's the generals, the oligarchs, the people who have the money and the power, they're not going to want to give it up.
I saw this fellow Karaskovsky, who is used to run the one of the two state oil companies in Russia, who got on the wrong side of Putin and went to jail for 10 years and stripped of his company and his position and his power. And now he's obviously a critic of Putin. But he said, what we don't understand in the West is the oligarchs really don't have any power, that it all comes from Putin. And any of them know at any time he can come take it away. And he said, so it's not like there's a federation of oligarchs who are meeting and voting.
I think that's true. Yeah, Khodorkovsky, I think his name was, right?
Yes.
I think it's a combination of some of them and the generals, just the military. I mean, in any autocracy, it's the military who holds things together.
Always. And it's amazing to say, I think it's a half a dozen to date of his senior leaders, 4 generals and 2 other high-ranking military officials have been killed on the front lines.
Right.
Because they need to get there to get anything done.
Right.
And obviously the Ukrainians are focused on taking out the leadership.
Yes. The other fascinating thing is how they've used digital media really as a weapon. They're fighting a digital war. There's 300,000 people in the Ukraine and also other volunteers who are hacking into Russia, who are constantly using technology to go at the soft underbelly of the Russians.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, and they're hacking in on there was a great interview with somebody at Time magazine that was on Fresh Air that I was listening to. And we don't realize the digital sophistication, because don't forget how many companies have coding operations
in Ukraine. Isn't Ukraine the tech back office for Israel?
It is, exactly. It is. Yes.
Because every Israeli company, our development teams in the Ukraine.
Absolutely, and a lot of them brought people back and at great expense and at risk to a lot of people. But they're even using Telegram to try and convince Russian soldiers to surrender and to give locations of where their tanks are. It's a different kind of a war.
Yeah.
In that way. And I may be wrong. Putin may be able to hold out, but at a certain point,
it takes 1 to make a war, but 2 to make a peace. And how do you give him enough face that, I'm thinking of Zelensky and the other Ukrainian leaders. How can they say, all right, thanks for killing so many of our people, we'll give you this big chunk of our country? I mean, they're in a corner too. They can't do that.
No, and he said, we're not going to give you the Donbass. We're not going to. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's a stalemate, which nobody ever thought could happen, because they thought the Russians would be in Kiev in 2 weeks or less.
Yep, that's what everyone thought. So impacts of this on things like you wouldn't expect. The acceleration of funding on energy technology to make us less globally dependent on tyrants with natural resources.
That's more true of Europe, I think, because we are net oil exporters. But look at Germany, and why Germany is in such a bind now, because I was not aware that so much of their oil and still comes from Russia. France, I think, is less, because France was more nuclear. But to your point earlier, nobody thought this would happen. So people thought the status quo would continue, and we could continue to play it down.
The rational mind would lead you there.
Correct. Angela Merkel played it down the middle, and, she had a dispute with Putin, but she continued to buy oil. And what's interesting, if, what Russia's done now is at a higher level than any of their evil. But talk to people who really know what's going on there. They put thousands of people in jail in Russia, just like China has 1 million Uyghurs in jail.
Yep.
So the violence made it impossible to ignore, but the quiet violence has continued for a long time, and we just worked around it. I
listened to Michael Zimblest. He's the chief economist for J.P. Morgan, the private asset management division there. He's extremely articulate, and he comes from a fact-based approach to all of these issues. And it's overwhelming that we are dependent on fossil fuels for quite a long time. But I just attended a conference that Techonomy put on called Techonomy Climate several weeks ago in Mountain View, California. And I would tell you, Adam, that I entered that conference, thinking as a small business person and a small entrepreneur, that, yeah, I knew climate was a big issue, and I knew there's plenty of data there. I probably gave too much airtime in my own head to the thoughts of people saying the atmosphere really isn't warming. It's really not that bad. All of these things go in big cycles. And after spending a couple of days there in Mountain View and hearing so many thoughtful and learned and really capable folks who were expert on the area, two things happened. One, it raised my level of awareness of how acute the climate issue is and how proximate really bad things are in that regard. But the second thing is, it was a room filled with 265 people, another 500 attendees digitally. And I left that room with a sense of enthusiasm because there is so many smart people who are giving their lives to this work. There is so much capital now seeing this multi-trillion-dollar collection of business opportunities and finding solutions to some of the climate challenges. In spite of getting depressed at how real and big and scary this is, but I left with a sense of enthusiasm. However, there was one young man, his name was Lucas Jopa. He's works for Microsoft. He's a chief environmental scientist. And he said to me, Jim, what right do we have as a people to think this will get better? He said, World War II changed the world in many, many, many ways, including the invention of the middle class here in the United States. He said, all the manufacturing in the world was destroyed except for here in North America. So it was devastated in Europe, devastated in Asia. And a very well thought out and bold plan called the Marshall Plan helped revive these economies. And instead of making them enemies forever, how do we bring them into the world of Western thought or of Western thinking, at least? And so we created the middle class. The idea before that a factory worker, that a logistics worker, that a production worker could live past their working years, have access to good health care, live comfortably, TV, a car, sometimes a second automobile. Oh, and by the way, have retirement benefits, either in the form of a pension or Social Security, and live their quote unquote golden years, is a phenomenon that never existed before in the world, and we're not certain can survive. It's not something we should take for granted. So right. It's only these several generations that has lived this well. And before that, living was awfully darn hard.
Yes.
And what right do we have to think that it'll get better on its own? And,
yes.
And that conversation that night with Lucas has caused me to have really interesting thoughts as an older person with grandchildren, and it's caused me to think differently about climate issues.
There's a really interesting book called A Farewell to Alms. It's a pun, ALMS, which is quite fascinating, and it details essentially the dispersion of wealth and other benefits across hundreds of years. And while not linear, we are making progress. And Steven Pinker's book also suggests that. And I think it was Henry Ford, right, who said anybody who works on an assembly line should be able to afford the car they make.
Yes.
But I think we're hollowing out the middle class now. I think it's really what's happening is disastrous. The lack of wage growth among huge segments of the population. I think more than half the population earns less than. I think half the population earns a minimum wage or something like that, right?
That's right.
It's like those numbers. This gets back to the sense of entitlement. Oh, I'll work from home. People don't realize half of the country earns less than $10 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is not. I don't think that's sustainable. Just like I don't think our current production of carbon is sustainable.
He's accused me basically of being lazy in my thought pre this conference to thinking it'll work itself out. What right do we have to think that? What evidence is there to that? And he says, I'm an evidence-based guy, and let me show you the evidence. Bill Gross the famous entrepreneur investor from Idea Lab, he spoke about the fact that he was born in 1973, and at that time there were 350 carbon particulates in a meter of a measurement of air, and today it's 450. He says that's empirical data about carbon starting to saturate the air.
Right.
I asked the question. We all drive automobiles all over the planet, and every couple of few years we have to get new tires for a car. Where do all those particulates go that wear off the tires?
They're in the air, and they call it heart pollution. And they say that heart pollution kills more people than cigarette smoke.
No.
And what about, and what about the microbeads that we're now finding in food, in the food supply? From the plastics, from all the plastics that are in the landfill. There's a whole, in the last couple of years, people have been really raising the issue of microplastics and microbeads, all the plastics that are in the packaging around us.
Mm-hmm.
We produce these tiny little, almost microscopic beads that end up in the air, in the water, in the food supply, in the ocean, clearly. Fish eat them.
All the more reason for cultured meats.
Yes, lab-grown, and fish, lab-grown fish.
Yep.
Aquaculture.
Which brings me to our last topic.
Yes.
Maybe that's why we all have this increasing interest in cannabis. So you know a lot about the subject. You work with companies that are in and around the space.
Yes.
Tell me, here we are in 2022. I think it's 18 states allow some form of cannabis consumption. A bunch of others allow for medical purposes. When we gather 3 years from now, what will we be saying about where we are in the cannabis legalization process? And what are we starting to see in terms of consequences, good or bad, from the relaxation of the laws regarding consumption of cannabis?
So I think we'll see continued state by state legalization of recreational use. I think New York obviously is here, Jersey is here. I think that we'll see increasing benefits because standardization and aggressive lab testing will make sure that a lot of the bad stuff that's now sold on the street is going to be negatively impacted. Although, if you put too high of a tax on something, you know what happens: the black market will win.
Well, that's one of the consequences I'd ask you about, because you have states that have been there for some time. Black market hasn't gone away.
It hasn't, but I think the black market has some of the more extreme, sort of the crappier product, the more dangerous product is harder to sell because consumers are becoming more sophisticated and they understand the difference. I think that we're going to see a lot more research into what this plant can do. Plants been around for as long as we've been around, and so many cultures have been using it in moderation to provide medical benefits, relaxation benefits, stress benefits, escape benefits. Look, there's a thought experiment that says if we knew everything we know right now about cannabis and alcohol, which would be legal and which wouldn't be legal?
I think we know what the answer to that question would be.
Answer. So, yeah, I think we'll see a lot more sophisticated use. Look at the data now. A lot of baby boomers are using it for pain reduction and for stress reduction. And what's the number? 75% of the population has experienced stress in the last year or two, where we don't want people using alcohol as a palliative. We'd rather have them use cannabis the right way. We don't want people using opioids, obviously. So I think this is the moment where the combination of legalization and the fact that we are a society under massive pressure is going to come together, I think. But
so you have two things happening that you just spoke about. One is the process of legalization, and you have the stress that's been exaggerated on our population as a result of the pandemic. Is it the perfect moment for cannabis to really thrust itself as an appropriate safer way for people to cope, to relax, to recreate?
Yes, I think it is. I think that once as the stigma is lifted, I think we're going to see normalization, and I think people will start to use it with the respect that it's due, and there'll be more innovations, and we're going to see more standardization, better products. We'll see some of the big CPG companies come into it. They're all looking at it now.
Yep.
Obviously.
So then the follow-up there, and I think I know what your answer will be here, but being involved in a very small way in the synthetic biology business to see what can be done now to create CBDs in a laboratory setting through a fermentation process using natural molecules in a much more controlled, less expensive to produce way. I know our scientists can do it for the THP side of it as well. The people who are investing a lot of money in greenhouses about to come into a harsh reality? And will they be converting back to flowers?
Or if you think about wine, so you can make wine out of the grape now, just like you can make Impossible meat or Impossible Foods Beyond Meat, but it doesn't have the terroir. So you'll be able to synthesize some aspects of some cannabinoids, but whether or not it will ever come up to the standard of the actual plant, the thing that's grown in the ground or in growing media that's made from the actual plant, I don't know. I don't think so, but I do think just like insulin, which is now produced out of, out of the pig's bladder, insulin is made in the lab. So I think.
Yep. So there's no absolute.
No, it'll be a continuum.
Yep. That's what I suspect. I would tell you, I've evolved to that in the last 6 to 12 months because I thought, why would people go through this infrastructure if it can be done so much more effectively in the lab? But as you say, I can get protein a lot of different ways without sitting down and eating a nice fish dinner. But there's something really nice about sitting down and eat a really well-prepared nice fish dinner.
Exactly. Or it'll be tough to grow Peter Luger in a lab.
Yes. Adam, we covered so much and yet barely scratched the surface on so many things. You're a great friend. You're a great board member here at Flowers, and I so value our friendship and all that I get to learn from you every time we chat.
Well, I'm honored that you had me as one of your inaugural guests. I think you have so much experience and wisdom to share with the world and so much perspective across different domains. So
what I have is curiosity and a roster of really good friends.
The reason I think they're related, you have a roster of really good friends because you're curious.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I know I'll be sharing it forward. I hope you get to as well. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow me along on Twitter at Jim1800Flowers and on LinkedIn at Jim McCann. Hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to Celebrations Chatter. You can join our community by reaching out at chatter@celebrations.com. And while you're at it, tell us what topics you'd like us to explore here on the Celebrations Chatter podcast. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to share it forward.